Picture this. Christopher Moltisanti is sitting alone in his car. It's dark, he's high, and somewhere behind those glazed eyes, there's a person who genuinely, desperately wanted to be something more than this. He wanted to be a writer, a filmmaker, a man his father, whoever that was, could have been proud of. He wanted sobriety, he wanted respect, he wanted to look in the mirror and actually recognize who was looking back. But he couldn't get there. No matter how many times he tried, he always ended up right back here, alone, high, disappearing. And the question that haunts every single scene Christopher Moltisanti is in is this. Why? Why, with all that self-awareness, all that pain, all that visible desire to escape, why could Christopher Moltisanti never truly change? The easy answer is drugs. It's always drugs with Christopher, right? The heroin, the relapses, the interventions. That's what everyone points to. But here's the thing. Addiction is never the origin. It's always the symptom. Christopher didn't become emotionally broken because he started using. He started using because something inside him had already been broken for a very long time. The drugs were just the most visible crack in a wall that had been crumbling since childhood. What we're going to explore today goes much deeper than heroin. We're going to trace the psychological architecture of Christopher Moltisanti, the insecurity, the trauma, the warped masculinity, the fantasy, the absent fathers, and the one man who both shaped him and slowly destroyed him. Because Christopher's greatest enemy was never the needle. It was the world that made him reach for it. Let's start where Christopher always starts, in the dark. Heroin gave Christopher something the mob life couldn't. Numbness. Not peace, not happiness, but the specific relief of not feeling everything so loudly. And Christopher felt things loudly. That was always his problem in a world where feeling anything at all was considered weakness. When we first see Christopher's addiction take full hold, it isn't just recreational. It's desperate. He's using with Adriana in their apartment, and there's something almost tender and horrible about it. Two people who love each other, slowly poisoning themselves together and calling it intimacy. The intervention scene is one of the most psychologically brutal moments in the entire series. Everyone sits around Christopher, and for one fragile moment you think, this is it. This is where he turns around. Tony is there. The family is there. Someone finally sees him. But watch Tony's face during that scene. There's discomfort. There's irritation. There's not unconditional love. And Christopher sees that. Of course he does. He always sees it. He goes to rehab. He gets sober. He shares at meetings. And for a while, genuinely, heartbreakingly, he tries. He talks about his higher power. He talks about his pain. He is, in those moments, more emotionally honest than anyone else in the entire DeMeo crime family. And then he relapses. Not because he's weak, but because sobriety forced him to feel everything he'd been running from, and the world he lived in gave him no tools to survive that feeling sober. Here's something the show does brilliantly. Christopher is constantly furious, but if you pay attention, almost every explosion of rage traces back to one thing. He felt small. He is pathologically sensitive to disrespect. Someone laughs at the wrong time. Someone questions his judgment. Someone gets a promotion he didn't. And Christopher doesn't just get annoyed, he unravels. Because for Christopher, disrespect isn't just an insult. It's confirmation of his worst fear, that he doesn't matter. This is a man who memorizes slights the way other people memorize birthdays. And the tragedy is that this insecurity made him violent in the exact same moments it made him most vulnerable. He couldn't say, that hurt me. He could only say, I will make you pay for that. The emotional vocabulary simply wasn't there. His Hollywood ambitions, the screenwriting, the movie obsession, were never really about art. They were about finally being seen, being recognized, walking into a room and having people already know who he was without him having to prove it with a gun. Christopher wanted fame the way a child wants to be picked first, not for the prize, for what it would mean about his worth. The world Christopher Moltisanti grew up in had a very specific idea of what a man was supposed to be. Hard, unfeeling, dominant, never confused, never scared, never soft. This is mob culture as psychological warfare. Every single day, Christopher was surrounded by men who performed stoicism as identity, who laughed at vulnerability, who communicated through violence, who treated emotional literacy as something vaguely embarrassing, a character flaw. And Christopher, who felt too much, had to constantly translate his interior life into the only language this world understood, aggression. Watch how he treats Adriana. He loves her. You can see it, genuinely. But he cannot show it in any healthy way. Because showing love meant opening up. And opening up meant being exposed. And being exposed in that world meant being destroyed. So instead of tenderness, he gives her jealousy. Instead of vulnerability, he gives her control. Instead of honesty, he gives her violence. He is not a monster. He is a person who was handed a completely broken map for human connection and then punished every time he got lost. The mob didn't just give Christopher a career, it amputated his emotional development and told him to be grateful for the surgery. This is one of the most quietly devastating threads in Christopher's entire story. He loves movies, not casually, obsessively. He watches them, studies them, lives inside them. And when he decides to write a screenplay, it isn't a hobby. It's a survival strategy. Movies were the one place Christopher could imagine a version of himself that made sense. He wanted to be the guy who told the story, not just the one living it. The Jon Favreau subplot is almost too sad to watch once you understand it. Christopher meets a real filmmaker, someone from the world he idolizes, and for a brief window he gets to exist inside his fantasy. And then he brings the mob with him, because he always does, because he doesn't know how not to. Cleaver, his eventual film, is so revealing it's almost a confession. It's a revenge fantasy where the Christopher character kills the Tony character. He made a film about murdering his mentor and then sat in a theater next to Tony and watched it. That is not subtle psychological behavior. That is a scream. But here's the thing. The film actually gets made. Christopher achieves something. But it doesn't fix anything. It doesn't fill the hole. Because the hole was never about Hollywood. It was about something much older and much harder to reach. Christopher Moltisanti grew up without a father. Dickie Moltisanti, his dad, was killed when Christopher was a child. And that absence became a gravitational force in everything Christopher ever did. Every relationship, every decision, every desperate reach for approval. He needed someone to tell him how to be a man. More than that, he needed someone to tell him he was one. And then there was Tony. Tony Soprano enters Christopher's life as a mentor, a boss, a protector. And in Christopher's orphaned psychology, Tony becomes something else entirely. The father he never had. The man whose approval, if he could just finally earn it, would make everything make sense. This is the most heartbreaking dynamic in the entire series, because Tony does love Christopher, in his way. In Tony Soprano's fractured, self-serving, genuinely affectionate way. But Tony's love always comes with conditions. It comes with humiliation. It comes with the unspoken expectation that Christopher will always need Tony more than Tony needs Christopher. And Christopher, who is starving for unconditional love, keeps taking this rationed, weaponized version of it and calling it enough. Here is the pattern of Christopher Moltisanti's life, repeated over and over with agonizing consistency. He reaches for something better, he almost gets there, and then he destroys it. Sobriety, broken. His relationship with Adriana, poisoned and ultimately horrifyingly ended by his own choice. His film career, real but never sufficient. His standing in the family, always precarious, always one emotional crisis away from collapse. And this is the part that makes Christopher genuinely tragic rather than just pathetic. He knows. He can articulate his own self-destruction with a clarity that most people in his world never come close to. In his most honest moments, in the car with Tony, in AA meetings, in quiet scenes with Adriana, Christopher says true things, real things. Things that show he understands exactly what's happening to him. But understanding your cage doesn't automatically give you the key. Christopher had insight without the architecture to act on it. He could see the wall perfectly, he just never learned how to climb. So why could Christopher Moltisanti never truly change? Not because he was stupid, not because he was purely evil, not even simply because of the drugs. Christopher couldn't change because every single system that was supposed to help him develop, family, culture, love, identity, was broken before he ever arrived. He inherited a world where vulnerability was punished, where pain had to be performed as aggression, where love was always conditional. He was handed a script he didn't write and was never given permission to put it down. And what makes him so haunting, what makes The Sopranos return to Christopher again and again, is that somewhere inside all that damage, there was a genuinely sensitive, genuinely intelligent, genuinely reaching human being. A person who wanted to make something, who wanted to be seen, who wanted to be loved without having to earn it. That person never got out, not because he didn't want to, but because the world that made him didn't give him the tools. And the one man who might have helped him, the man he loved like a father, needed Christopher to stay broken. There's a version of Christopher Moltisanti where things go differently, where someone in that intervention actually reaches him, where Tony says the right thing at the right time, where the screenplay leads somewhere real. That version doesn't exist in the show. It was never going to. But the fact that you can picture it, the fact that you can feel the distance between who Christopher was and who he might have been, that's the whole tragedy. Maybe Christopher's greatest tragedy wasn't the addiction, or the violence, or Tony, or the world that shaped him. Maybe it was simply this, that deep down, quietly, in every single scene, he knew. He knew exactly what was happening to him. But he couldn't stop it anyway. If this essay resonated with you, consider sharing it. And if there's another character trapped between who they are and who they wanted to be, drop their name in the comments. There are more stories like Christopher's than we'd like to admit.